Welcome everyone to the Sustainability Education Research Institute. I'm the director, Marcia McKenzie, and we're very pleased to have a guest speaker, Dr. Stephen Sterling, joining us today. Naomi Mena is a PhD student here in SERI, and she'll be facilitating the presentation, and we're going to have an interview-style format. And hopefully an opportunity for other folks to ask some questions at the end. But before passing it over to Naomi, we wanted to do a brief intro of who's in the room for Stephen, and also to let folks know this will be recorded and shared on the web too. So if you could just give your name and maybe if you're a student or your role here.
Hi, Dr. Sterling. My name is Jada Kushik. I'm a PhD student here at SEPN, working with Marcia on the Sustainability Education Policy Network.
Okay, great.
Hi, I'm Yvonne Cedina. I'm a PhD student, and I'm working with Aboriginal issues in sustainability and conservation.
In higher education. Higher education.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Adam. I'm working for the SEPN project as well. I'm a Master of Education student.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Andrew Beeler, and I'm a postdoc here at SEPN. I write on art sciences collaborations, and I'm doing document analysis here at SEPN, looking at post-secondary sustainability education at the moment.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Ellie. I'm a second-year ed student.
Yeah.
I haven't seen you for quite some time, Steve.
I've seen you from it before. Yeah, very strange. Okay.
And we've got a few more here. Kristen?
My name's Kristen. I'm also a master's student working on the SEPN project.
I'm Janet McVitie. I'm a colleague of Marcia's from the Foundation. I'm on sabbatical.
I'm Ranjan Jata, PhD student from the School of Environment and Sustainability. I'm working on indigenous ways of knowing land management and sustainability.
And I'm Kathleen Aiken, and I'm a PhD student with the Sustainability and Education Policy Network, but I'm working with K-12 education.
Okay.
And we also have like 3 or 4 people joining online, but I don't think we have time for them to introduce themselves. Well, maybe, I don't know. That might be too
I can actually see it.
Yeah, true.
I can actually see about 8.5 of you, but never mind. It's nice to know there's other people there too. And I also feel like I'm about 8 feet tall because the camera's.
It's true. Yeah. Yes, your head is about 1.5 feet tall.
I hope I won't be talking down to you, so to speak. Okay.
All right, so I'm going to introduce Dr. Sterling and follow the questions later. So Dr. Sterling is Head of Education for Sustainable Development at the Center for Sustainable Future at Plymouth University in the UK. He's also the advisor for United Kingdom Higher Education Academy on Education for Sustainable Development. And he has worked over the several past years as a consultant in both environment and sustainability in academia and in nonprofit organizations. And his research looks at the interrelationships between ecological thinking, systemic change, and learning of individual and institutional scales to help meet the challenges of accelerating the educational response to sustainability, and also looks at transformative learning. Some of his works include his book that was edited with John Huckle, that's Education for Sustainability, 1996, and he has also his 2001 book, Schumacher Briefing, Sustainable Education, Revisioning, Learning, and Change, and then 2 of his recent books, this one, Sustainability Education, Perspectives and Practice Across Higher Education, and this book was written with David Sebi and Paula Jones, and it was actually recognized as one of the top 40 books of 2010. And then his most recent book is The Sustainable University, Progress and Prospects, that was written in 2013. And Dr. Sterling has also, he won the Vice Chancellor Enterprise Award for Outstanding Contributions to the University regarding Sustainability Agenda. And he also has another book. Oh, actually, that's the one. And without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Stephen Sterling.
Okay, can I just say it's particularly a real pleasure to link with the University of Saskatchewan because, as my brother in the corner there will tell you there, I lived in Saskatchewan in the late 70s for 3 years and taught in the Saskatoon School Board and in a Cree Reserve up near North Battleford. So, you know, I know Saskatoon, I know Saskatchewan, and it's nice to contact with you again. Yeah.
It's very nice to have you, so thank you. Yep. All right, so our first question for you, Dr. Sterling, is could you provide some of the history of sustainability in education in higher ed research field? For example, when do you see the field is beginning, and what have been some of the main trajectories and issues of study historically?
Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background, I've been working in this area for about 40 years, you know, it's getting on a bit now, and so a long engagement. And really my question all these years has been what sort of education is most appropriate for the times we live in? What can it be? What should it be? And so on. How can that be brought about? So really that's been my overall research question, if you like, all this time. I don't see myself as a frontline researcher, particularly around empirical research, but I have been seen as something of a thought leader. So that's been my role over the years. So I shall be answering questions from that kind of role I've occupied during this time. So to answer that question, back in the early 80s, I worked for a national charity which promoted environmental education. And I remember we were asked a question about what research had been done in the field of environmental education. And we actually found that quite difficult to answer because there wasn't much then. And that's the research which was done was largely relating to schools and largely small scale. Now I remember discussions which led to the founding of the journal Environmental Education Research, which came out in its first issue in 1995. So that's really not that long ago. And I think the other main journals, such as the Australian Journal, the South African Journal, and indeed the Canadian Journal, and then the Journal of ESD from India, they all came some years later. So really, we're looking at quite a young field of research here compared to other educational fields. And if you look at, I've had most to do with EER, Environmental Education Research, and if you look at early issues, they're largely all dominated by schools-based research and not higher education. So really, higher education came into the picture much later, really. And it's still really, if you take higher education research as a whole, as you know, just a small part of what goes on in terms of activity and funding. In terms of the main trends, I did a chapter for a book which is about to come out actually fairly soon, taking a sort of an overview of education for sustainable development research. And in that chapter, I made the distinction between 3 levels, if you like, scales. So there's micro, meso, and macro level. So on the micro level, that's really to do with the experience of the individual learner. What's the current state of awareness, attitudinal stance, knowledge and understanding, and so on amongst students. So that's still if you look at ESD/EE journals, that's still a strong tendency in that area. In the meso level, the focus is on, I'm talking about formal education here, not non-formal, by the way. The focus is on teaching and learning practices in higher education, in pedagogy, basically, about ESD pedagogy and innovative pedagogies and so on, evaluation. And then the macro level is really about curriculum change and organizational learning and system change in education. And I think if you think about that model of those three levels, I think it's fair to say there's been a shift of interest towards the meso and macro levels. So not just looking at individual learners anymore, but looking at pedagogies and beyond that, system change, really. And certainly if I think about our work at Plymouth University, a lot of our work has been across those levels, but particularly interested in whole institutional change, which is quite an interesting idea, which we've been pursuing for maybe 10 years now, and has been echoed by UNESCO more recently. Okay, I'm going to try not to talk too much because I can see this hour just flashing by. So and do interrupt if you think I'm talking too much. Next question. Okay.
All right, so thank you. The next question is, what do you see as some of the main issues within sustainability education research in higher education today?
Well, as I just implied, it's still arguably too small in scale. Too few researchers involved compared to higher education research as a whole, and along with that, it's insufficient funding for large-scale research. I think as a research community, we are too insular. We talk to each other, which is kind of intellectually interesting, but doesn't necessarily make a wider impact. So we need to break through to others' research agendas. And I think, from my point of view, I think the idea of research as change, seeing the research process as being part of a change process, is important, rather than the dominant view, which is really, research about change, which you can then develop data and get the thing published. So there's emphasis on publication sometimes gets in the way of sort of radical research, as you might say, which makes a difference, which I think is important. At a larger scale, I know one of the questions relates to one of the papers I wrote based on my UNESCO research for the end of decade conference. And what I found then was a lack of systematic research on ESD, longitudinal research and large-scale research. It's not an area which, there's been, in a way, an astounding amount of activity in the last 10 years. It's still relatively small compared to the field of research as a whole.
And based on your knowledge of the field, what recommendations do you have for how higher education can effectively further sustainability education and research?
Anything to add, I guess, beyond what kind of spoke about a bit already, but anything to add there?
Well, yeah, it sort of follows on from what I'm saying, really, which is, how do we put sustainability? I mean, some people don't like the word sustainability, which is fair enough. Whatever you want to call it, well-being or futures research or whatever the term is appropriate. How do we get that into more broadly into educational research priorities? I think that's what we need to address. And I think there's always going to be a need for specialist centres such as your own to drive the agenda, but to get greater purchase and progress, I think we need to somehow develop a greater awareness of real-world context informing educational research as a whole. I mean, this is happening to a degree. So it's clear that education for sustainability research papers are now appearing in all sorts of other education research journals and not just in the specialist journals. So that's a good thing.
And can you speak a little bit about the differences in terminology used in environmental education and sustainability education, fields in a broad way, and then which of these terms have been used predominantly within sustainability in higher education and why?
Yeah, it's an old chestnut, this one. You know, it's also quite a problem, really. And I know when I wrote my doctoral thesis, I addressed this to some extent, because, you know, like any label, you know, what is a label for? It's to communicate, and it does communicate, but also it can, you know, depending on how it's read, it can limit meaning too. So there's a real problem with semantics here, not least because of the profusion of different terms. So I think I'm right in saying education for sustainability or learning for sustainability is dominant in Canada, is that right? Or is it ESD?
It depends at the level. So sustainability is much more common at the higher ed level and at the policy level as well, we found, and then at the K-12 level, it's environment that's more dominant, although sustainability is, you know, still on the rise there as well. But not ESD. A few provinces at the K-12 level ESD, but not very.
Yeah, I mean, to answer your question backwards, if you like, we tend to use ESD mostly because the government does, so therefore it has some legitimation, but there's all sorts of issues with that, and UNESCO does, of course, you know, so to some extent you have to play that particular game, but, you know, without spending the whole hour or what's left of the hour on this particular issue, because it's quite a big one, I'll just make a few comments. I wrote a chapter for a book by John Blewett a few years back, looking at the emergence of these terms and, you know, and their different meanings and so on. And I remember making an argument about a sort of contradictory trend of increasing inclusivity on the one hand, but fragmentation on the other. So if you look at the history of all this, you know, so environmental education comes out of local studies and rural studies and so on. And that became environmental education, which then, you know, involved more social and political aspects and so on. And then it sort of evolved into ESD, which then brought in other aspects, and economic and political and social justice and so on. And, you know, you have a sort of a widening, a broadening of the agenda, but then you start getting fragmentation with people making claims, sort of knowledge claims and legitimacy claims around environmental education and development education, education for global citizenship. And then if you put all the other terms flying around, such as, you know, education for human rights and equality and diversity and health and well-being and conservation and humane education, transformative education and so on, you know, it gets a complete muddle. So, you know, what are we talking about, essentially? So I tend to think that the philosophical basis and values implicit in what you're doing is probably more important than the term you're using. And if you do use a particular term, you know, my question to people is, where are your boundaries, really? So if you say this is ESD and that isn't, or that's EFS and that isn't, what makes that EFS and that over there isn't, you know? And I like the idea of permeable boundaries, because in a way, although there is a core of thinking and practice around these terms, which we share as a community, it's important that we actually involve other people. So making these terms and ideas meaningful to others and bringing other people's values and practice into this debate is really important. So if you use a particular term and then you put closed boundaries around it, saying this is my territory, then it's not serving anybody, you know, if you get my meaning. So, you know, there have been issues here about people, you know, resenting ESD because they think it's all about environmental education and so on. There is, you know, without going on too long, there is an issue around the term ESD, which I think is legitimate because some people see it as too outer-directed and too instrumentally oriented and a non-contested view of sustainable development, whereas other people prefer education for sustainability, which includes a more personal and inner dimension and so on. And I'm probably guilty of complicating the field further by my little book in 2001, which was mentioned, because I used the term sustainable education, because I wanted to get away from the idea of for, education for, and rather talk about the quality of education in the first place and imply that education itself needed a cultural shift in the same way as other areas of human activity needed a cultural shift. In the light of the sustainability imperative. Okay.
Well, I guess the next question related to that is we've been reading some works about, the debate about education for something, and such that education, sustainable development, and how. So how do you respond to the debate about putting education towards a cause? And do you see any greater implications with these discussions within ESD?
Yeah. Well, that leads on from the last question, of course, and it's another old tension which has been pervading the debate for some time. When I thought about this question, it reminded me of the chapter I wrote recently, which is in this book, which is going to come out, called A Handbook of HE for Sustainable Development. I picked up on a paper by a researcher called Søren Breiting. I think he's Danish, and he says, are we as researchers seeing ourselves as contributors to a quest for supporting education that solves current problems through whatever educational processes are necessary, or are we striving to support the creation of future educated citizens that are capable of making their own decisions? So he posits these two alternatives as being in tension. You either go for one or the other. And I think, again, without flying off for another half an hour on this discussion, because they're all potentially quite big questions, let me say one or two things about this. So I think this illustrates some of the complexity here. So, when I do workshops, I sometimes put this term, education for sustainable development, up on the whiteboard. And then I put rings around the different terms, because if you just take education itself, that's been a huge debate for hundreds of years. And what's education about? What's it for? How's it done? What's the purpose of it? And then sustainable development, that's another huge term. What does that mean? What's it for? What does it imply? Da, 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 da. And then the word for, meaning that which links the two, and you suddenly got a very complex picture on the whiteboard in terms of 4 words. So in essence, if you look at people in this debate, some people are more primarily, let's say, interested in education and learning, the quality of education and learning. That's what floats their boat, as the saying goes. Then others are particularly interested in so that's what you might call an intrinsic values view of education. Education is good in itself. Then there's others who really see education as a vehicle for change. So it has an instrumental view. They have an instrumental view of education, and their primary interest is in addressing sustainability issues. So there's quite a few people who think these two views are incompatible. So in a way, I invite you to think that through yourselves, whether they are or they aren't. My view is they're not. They don't have to be, and I justify that by saying that all education is value laden. Right. Although there's deeply ingrained view in education that it can be value free, of course. And the second point is that the world is not in a neutral, stable, fair, and benign place for all. Rather, rather the opposite. And the time to make a shift towards a more sustainable world is short. So, if you look at I don't know if you've come across Rockstrom's model of planetary boundaries, which has influenced the Sustainable Development Goals debate. Clearly there are huge issues to be faced, and education has a role in that. But I don't think saying that it means that in any way diminishes the quality of the educational process. So in a way, the education side of the equation is about quality, the sustainable development side of the equation is about direction, and I don't think those two things are compatible, although some people would say they are. And I think that, if you look at David Orr's work, for example, I think he's a good example of arguing that through in a cogent way. It doesn't mean to say that educational processes should be prescriptive and closed and doctrinaire, but rather the opposite, developing graduates who are resourceful, resilient, creative, socially adept and so on, and can address some of these big issues. Okay.
Thank you. Our next question is, in your article, Separate Tracks or Real Synergy, you advocate for continued learning among all stakeholders to realize sustainable development. How do you envision higher education taking up this challenge while also working to improve their own sustainability initiatives such as curriculum, facilities management, research, and outreach?
Yeah. Okay. I best answer that by talking a little bit about what we've done at Plymouth, really. So we've had, in a way, a 10-year experiment to try and shift the culture of the university as a whole, because I don't think there's I don't think it's, ideally it's not up to just the enthusiasts in the university to make a change. What we're trying to do, and there's a lot of, quite a large network here of students and staff involved in this process, of how to realign policy and practice more towards sustainability ideas and values. And it takes time. I could certainly talk more about that if that was of interest. But there's an argument whether simply you change curricula, or you change pedagogy, or you change some policies. And meantime, the university does a lot of other things at the same time, which may even be contradictory or counterproductive. But if you look at my book, The Sustainable University, I'm trying to argue really that the shifting context in the real world actually, in a way, invites universities to reorient themselves around, the pressing questions of relationship, which need to be addressed, which really apply to all the big issues over the next 50 years. But in a way, what else are the universities for? I'm a bit of a radical on this one. When I thought about this question in advance, I copied out a quote from a guy called Paul Raskin, who's a futurist in the States and a futures writer, and he talks about the soaring intellectual challenge of creating knowledge, pedagogy, and engagement for transition would align with the twin desiderata of advancing cutting-edge scholarship and human good. And it reminds me also that Arjen Wolds, I'm sure you've looked at some of Arjen Wolds' writing, a leading sustainability education writer in the Netherlands, talks about engaged scholarship with a planetary conscience. So I think there's a real challenge and a real opportunity to shift HE as a whole, so that in a sense we all become learners, in this transition. And I'm also reminded of the approach being taken at University of British Columbia, in Canada, obviously, where I note they are talking about going beyond what they describe as damage limitation. In other words, what I would call, education for making the world a bit less unsustainable, if you like, towards what UBC call regenerative sustainability, human activity that simultaneously improves environmental and human well-being. So that's bold and visionary, and I think it can be done. So, how do we shift higher education policy in a way which is pragmatic and realistic, but still bold and future-facing? And how do we shift current HE agendas so they embrace sustainability in a meaningful way, and so on? So these are big challenges which we're working on here at Plymouth, and a lot of other universities are working on internationally. Okay.
All right. The next question is, in your chapter, Higher Education Sustainability and the Role of Systemic Learning, you discuss the system's approach to sustainable development and talk about the role of different actors, that is policymakers, administrators, faculty, students, in realizing the deep learning and reorientation by conscious design. Who among these actors do you see as taking the leadership role in such a systemic change?
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, I'm sure you know that if you look at this literature, just about everybody writes about this. There's no blueprint. There's no blueprint for change. You do step one, and then when you've done step one, you do step two. All there is people's experience, which we can learn from. I'm reminded of the late Donella Meadows, who in one of the top of her own books, I can't remember the title now, I can't remember, it doesn't matter. She talks about everybody needs to be a learning leader. Everybody needs to be a learning leader. So, it's quite an important idea. But, in a way, if you take an institution like a university, almost that process can start anywhere. It can start amongst the students, it can start amongst some committed staff and so on, and spread out. So there isn't a simple answer to this question. And what we've tried to do here is, at Plymouth, is look at ideas of systemic learning and organizational change and organizational learning and put those into operation. And so leadership has come from those who have been in a position to begin to make change. And there's a long story of how that's occurred here. But one thing I would say is, and this is something I say to others when they ask me to talk about progress at Plymouth. And by the way, I should say, without being overly modest, we've just been recognized as the leading university in a national league called the People and Planet Green League, which we've been measured against about 13 different criteria, and we've come out at the top of the sector this year, which is very nice. And what I would say is that in the change process, which takes time, somebody or some group, even better, needs to hold what I call a critical intelligence over time. So that if you're instigating and trying to encourage change, you need to monitor that and evaluate it and look for opportunities by which that change can be disseminated and spread and more people engaged. So, and in a way, like some sort of large action research project, keep a clear strategic view of what's happening, what needs to happen, and where the opportunities and barriers are, and keep that, in a way, that sort of organizational memory going over years, really, in order to make significant change. So, in a way, what you're trying to do is empower and enable more and more people to be leaders within their own areas of influence within the institution. And people talk about should change be top down or bottom up. In a way, ideally it would be both at the same time. But what we've found here is even more important than those two is being what we might call middle out. So we've been fortunate enough to have a centre, in a sense, in the middle of the hierarchy, able to galvanize change in the student body and begin to influence senior management, such as they now see sustainability as one of the key identifiers of Plymouth University. So that's taken time. And I think the universities where the where the director or principal or rector, whatever you call it, of the university imposes that change is much less likely to succeed. Okay, just that one.
I'm just going to piggyback on that question in terms of diversity and who's involved in this systemic change. How do you see that playing in terms of gender, class, race within higher education?
Well, I don't have a specific answer to that really, because I mean, it's really this echoes the another agenda here. Plymouth and other universities in the UK is one of inclusivity. So in a way, what we're doing here is just echoes that inclusivity agenda, where we're trying to involve as many parts of our university community as we can, in a fair and in a fair way, which doesn't involve barriers. And we have Plymouth is not a particularly privileged area in terms of its socioeconomic background. We have a lot of students who from the local area who live at home. Some of the parts of Plymouth are economically depressed, and we try to involve students and indeed staff across the board. So there's no discrimination, let's say, which is active in this work.
Well, I'm going to open the floor for questions now from everybody. So if you have any questions you'd like to ask.
Hi, Jen, but I'm interested to know what inspired you, what motivated you personally to get involved in your field of studies?
I keep thinking any of these questions could take an hour each, so I have to do this briefly. I don't know really. As a kid, I'll try and give a short answer. As a kid, I was always, we were lucky. We lived in an area with fields and trees and meadows, and we were able to play outside a lot. And I think that had an influence on me. And I love nature, and I got involved, just as in my early teens in WWF and conservation organisations, and sent off the membership cards and all that sort of stuff, and had posters of whales on my bedroom wall and so on, all that sort of stuff. And then around, around 1970, 1972, there was a wave of environmentalism, which coincided with the Limits to Growth launch by Donello and Dennis Meadows and Jürgen Randers, and also the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. And I was very interested in all the reports coming out of those conferences, which is really the first international conference on the environment in 1972 in Stockholm. So I was very interested in that. And I think one formative experience I'll relate quickly is I was a student in London, and I went into one of the leading bookshops in London. And I was browsing, and I came across a book called Education for Survival. Teaching for Survival. And I thought, well, that's a heck of a title. So it was by an American author, and it's really about the environmental concerns at that time and the role of education in maybe addressing some of those concerns. And the Stockholm Conference actually was the first international conference to actually look at education as a means of addressing these issues, which has been repeated many times since at high level. So I came out of that bookshop with this book, and I thought, well, maybe that's what I'm going to do. I'll go into teaching as a way, and education as a way of beginning to address environmental issues. And I thought, you know, we already had teachers in the family. The one sitting in the corner there who's already a teacher. So I thought, well, he's survived so far. Maybe I can do the same thing. So that's how I got into education, because I did see it as a means of addressing these issues. Although, you know, my fairly simple view of it hopefully has got a lot more sophisticated since. I mean, the other quick thing I'd say is that I've always been interested in sort of systemic, sort of relational stroke ecological ideas, and it was only later in life I realized there was a whole field called systems thinking, which gave it a title, and I thought, well, that's what I've been doing since I was a kid, in a way, you know, sort of relational thinking, if you like. And in a way, I could sum up my career as encouraging people to think relationally. You know, that's in a way what I've done. Because I think that's one of the critical issues where we tend to fragment and compartmentalize so much, which is one of the real issues we need to, barriers that we need to address. Okay.
Maybe I can ask a follow-up question that kind of links off to the end of that. On behalf of a PhD student that's on the line, but we don't know how to have those folks ask questions. So a lot of your work focuses on that kind of systems approach to change within higher ed and kind of the aim of more transformative initiatives rather than kind of surface level change. And I wondered if you could speak to you know, has there been much literature that you're aware of that's looked at this in relation to organizational learning and organizational change? I know you used that term briefly before. We have a student that's focusing on that area, and if you can say kind of to the literature there, as well as in particular whether sustainability reporting, you know, in your view plays a role in more transformative change or not so much, and any comments there?
Yeah. Okay, so you know, in my own work, I've lent on people who have written about organizational learning to some extent. I mean, Donald Shon was a particular influence. Richard Borden, an Australian, that his work has been particularly helpful to me. The whole area of learning and transformative learning, I've particularly drawn on Gregory Bateson, who's been a key influence. Fritjof Capra to a degree. There's a guy called Bella Banafé, Systems View of Education, who I've drawn on. So these are some of the authors I've found particularly helpful. And but in a way, you know, you're right, Marcy. In a way, this stuff is not shouting at you. You have to go and dig for it, really, to some extent. And I've tried to apply that to the issues of systemic change towards sustainability within the university setting. And what else should I say? Oh yes, so the issue that you raised about monitoring and so on, and metrics, I think is another issue, and whether that's helpful or not. I think that's a really interesting question, and I think in a way the jury is out on that one, because as you know, we live in an age where everything has to be accountable and measured and so on, and that's entered the sustainability field as much as anywhere else. And there's two major schemes here. I'm not aware of schemes in Canada. I'm sure you can tell me, but there's two major schemes here. One of which is sort of semi-compulsory, because it's all universities are measured on using the Freedom of Information Act, and the other one is you elect to do it if you want to. And I think I'm a bit ambivalent myself about the effect of these indexes and schemes and metrics, because on the one hand, they have raised awareness about the far-reaching implications of sustainability for the operations and work and policy of a university. So even just by entering into these frameworks, you engage a lot of people in gathering data and so on. And then, you know, at a more prosaic level, you then, if you do well, you get some external recognition, which always which is good for the university and raises awareness further. But, you know, others would argue that it becomes a tick box exercise and it actually diminishes enthusiasm and annoys people because they have to be involved in something they're not particularly interested in, and it has a sort of deleterious effect on people's engagement. So, you know, I think it can be argued either way, but I think if it's carefully handled and you have a good metric or index, it can mostly be a positive exercise. You know, in the moment, just this morning I was discussing with colleagues here about doing a whole institution curriculum review. The last time we did it was 3 years ago, and it has to be done very sensitively because you know, you need to bring academics on board with you and make the review part of a learning process in itself, rather than another thing they have to do because it's being required of them. And I think part of the skill here is getting the timing right. You know, whatever change you're trying to bring in to a university, you need to bring people on board with you. If it becomes an imposition, then you just lose people and you get resentment. So this is in a way. This is why, in a way, systemic change takes time. Building up a pool of support and enthusiasm. It can't be done overnight. I don't know if I've wandered off the point, Marcia, but
no, that was great. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for your talk. This is great to have a review of your work. I was wondering if you could address, this is a big question, so you can kind of take it where you will. How can efforts towards systemic change in higher education address the more dominant understandings of institutional settings, such as those around the global economy?
Hey, I've lost your sound. No, I lost your sound. Okay, I think you're back.
Oh yeah?
Oh, we're back?
Yeah.
Hello?
Okay. Oh, now you're gone again. I've lost you again. No, lost you.
Yeah.
Okay, you're back.
Okay. So really enjoying your talk. I really enjoy your work. It's a pleasure to hear you speak. So I'm going to throw a big one at you. How can efforts towards systemic change in higher education address more dominant understandings of institutional settings, such as those around the global economy, or you know, dominant understandings of, you know, the setting of higher education within kind of shifts towards academic capitalism?
Yeah, that's a good question, and you know, you kind of, in my position, you have to be strategic, really. So clearly there are competing agendas in higher education. but you know, some are not. Some are actually compatible quite easily with sustainability if you can actually get positive work happening within your HEI. So for example, you know, one of the arguments to our senior management is if we go down this route in a serious way, we're going to develop our reputation in this area, and that will attract students, and that will attract funding, and that will attract research funding. So, you know, you're talking the language of senior management here in terms of student numbers and funding, and that works. We will get increased reputation. That works with them too. But you know, there is to a degree a tension with the whole neoliberal way of marketization of higher education. And you know, some people will argue that's completely incompatible with sustainability, and you could argue it that way. On the other hand, you could actually turn it to your advantage and talk about the need for graduates who are, you know, resourceful and resilient and flexible, and that's what employers want. So you can start making links with the employability agenda. So that's quite a fruitful line of inquiry. We also have an emphasis here at the University on enterprise, and you know, I argue that a lot of the major issues, you know, around climate change and biodiversity and social justice and whatever need to be addressed by graduates who are enterprising and entrepreneurial and can make a difference. So in a way, there's not necessarily a clash there either. The other big agenda, of course, is what students are requesting and arguing for, and that's, I'm not quite sure how the funding works in Canada anymore, but certainly here the students hold the purse strings through the student loan system. And we're lucky to have a national union of students here, the NUS, which has done 3 years of research on student attitudes for sustainable development. And what's really interesting about that is that consistently over 3 years, around 80% of students on a national basis are reporting that they want their universities to do more around sustainable development, 80%. So clearly, because students elect where they're going to spend their money and join programs, that's a very powerful argument for universities to get on board with this agenda. You know, so that's been particularly strong point of leverage over here. But there's an interesting piece of work done by a doctoral student at Keele University, and she's looked at the tension and compatibility between the sustainability agendas and the neoliberal agenda as her doctoral thesis, and she just published her first paper on it. And if you're interested in checking that out, her name is Sophie Besant. So B-E-S-S-A-N-T.
Thanks so much. I'll definitely check out Sophie's work and follow up.
Okay. Great. So you lost contact there, but okay.
Any more questions?
Can I comment on something you didn't ask me? In fact, on the list you sent through, and it's to do with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network and the UN Decade and so on. And I just want to say something very quickly. I was asked by an international body called the International Council for Science to look at the proposed Sustainable Development Goals and comment on the educational goal and associated targets. And I also looked at the work done by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network for their equivalent exercise, commenting on the proposed Sustainable Development Goals. And what's interesting is that their interpretation makes, when you look at Goal 4, which actually relates to education, they don't actually say anything about education as a vehicle for change towards sustainability, which I think is a real omission. So it's all about access to education, education for all, quality education, educational achievement, all of which are important, but nothing about how it relates to sustainability and sustainable development. So So in the work I did for the International Council for Science, which is a separate exercise, I made quite a strong play about adapting Goal 4, that's the Sustainable Development Goal, to make it relate much more strongly to sustainable development per se, and looking at education as a means of addressing the other 16 goals, which are part of the Sustainable Development Goals package. Because if you look at the, one of the things coming out of the UN end of decade conference, which I was fortunate enough to go to in Nagoya in November in Japan, is that there is a recognition that an awful lot of educational and training policies and programs make no difference to this area or have a deleterious influence, on the prospects for sustainability. So, there is a need for a critical re-evaluation of an awful lot of policies, so that the sustainable development trajectories and educational trajectories become much more synergetic, in their relationship. Yeah.
Any other questions? Martin, do you have questions?
I'll call you.
Come on, give me a hard time. Yeah.
I guess one of our last questions was, how can we as funding scholars in both EE and sustainability and higher education fields contribute significantly towards the progress of the field?
Well, probably sounds a little simple, but in a way there's all to play for. If you look at this whole area positively, in a way the whole idea of education for sustainable development as such, and its various permutations, only goes back to 1992. It's a very youthful, very young area of inquiry. Really very much so compared to other areas. So an awful lot's changed, an awful lot's been done, thought about, written in that time since. But as I've tried to indicate, there's still a big challenge ahead in terms of rethinking and reorienting education policy and practice, particularly in relation to, the key issues summarized in the Sustainable Development Goals, poverty, agriculture and food, and health and equity, and ecosystem health, and energy and waste, and so on and so on. These are massive issues which you only need to turn on the TV or pick up a newspaper to recognize are with us all the time. And we need bright minds to be creative and imaginative and committed to building a safe and more fair future. So, despite often worrying global trends, I think the level of awareness of the need for systemic rather than piecemeal change has never been higher, probably, amongst sectors of society which were never touched by this, let's say 20 years ago, in terms of their awareness. And I think there's because of that, there are more and more opportunities now for young people to be involved in areas which are exciting and generative and engaging and make a positive difference. So you can paint a sort of ain't it awful picture, if you like. Everything's terrible, but actually there's a lot of positive energy, I think, involved in this agenda, and there's a lot of international mandate, even if sometimes national governments don't quite get it, which support you in this work. So, without giving detailed answers, I think hopefully that indicates something of the positive mood I feel about this, actually. Yeah, and that's partly why I'm involved in this, because there's, we have students here who are just brimming with ideas and enthusiasm, which, in fact, talking to my colleague this morning, we're wondering how to create more student internships so we can actually harness their enthusiasm and get some really good things going, which I'm too old to imagine myself,
Even for the students that are working on sustainability in higher ed specifically, in terms of them kind of making the most contributions as well as learning from that, can you make some recommendations around journals and conferences that are kind of key places for making those connections and conversations internationally?
Well, it's good to see, it's good to see students being part of the conference scene these days. It's not just people who've been working with it in the field for 20, 30, 40 years. So to have students involved in that, I mean, we ran in fact, an international conference here in Plymouth last month, and we had 140 people and quite a lot of students involved as part of the program, which is great. So, I know, Marcia, you're going to the World Congress in Gothenburg in June, is it? So it'd be great to see students there for a start. And, there must be other avenues by which they can get involved, but I wouldn't necessarily know off the top of my head.
Yeah, there's not really an international sustainability and higher ed conference per se, yet that really stands out as the key conference.
I guess that probably the week is the biggest one, isn't it? I think probably. I mean, you've got ASHE in the US. I don't know how far students involved in that. Yeah.
And in terms of journals, the international journals, sustainability and higher ed.
Yeah, but all the others besides, I mean, the JEST is quite good. There's also that a fairly new online journal which goes by the unimaginative title of sustainability. You think they might have thought of something else, but it's just called sustainability. But it's quite good. There's some good stuff in there. That's online. So that's worth looking for. People tend to drift towards that one. There's a Journal of Sustainability Education coming out of the States, which is fairly new, but it's quite good, which is, again, online. And then there's the Environmental Education Journals, of course. But, as I said earlier, I think part of the trick is to get beyond the normal community and try to get papers and engagement with other journals, to broaden the discussion. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any final words of wisdom for us?
Hopefully. No, just keep going. I mean, I shared a platform with. I saw Marcia in Hobart, which is nice. When was that? November, wasn't it, Marcia? And I shared a platform with David Orr. David Orr's down in Hobart, and he said we were doing a public lecture together where we sort of interviewed each other. And his first question to me is, he said, "You're persistent," and then I won't say the rude word he said. Persistent. What keeps you going? So I guess that's true. And I'm just involved in this the whole time and have been. You just have to keep going, and be involved and be persistent and knock on doors and be enthusiastic and carry people with you. Because in a way the tide's in our favour on all this. More and more people are getting involved and interested and saying, "No, I know this is important, but what does it mean? How shall I respond?" So, I think the door is much more open than it was, much more open. So we need to just walk through it.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for coming. Let's pretty much. We appreciate you taking your time. I know you're very busy, and it was a kind of last-minute thing, but we really thank you for agreeing to speak to us. And hopefully in the future you can also get some more talks
might want to have you back.
Yeah, that would be great. I'm just amazed this technology works over thousands of miles. It's amazing, isn't it, really? But no, it's been a real pleasure, and almost as good as being there with you. But no, I wish you well, and I look forward to hearing more. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for the invite. It's been great.